I am Joe Pardivila, and this is the Forbes Books Podcast. And supply chain problems have become the business equivalent of the dog ate my homework. Everything and everyone is blaming the supply chain for issues across the planet. So what's it all about? My guest this week is my very own supply chain Yoda, Jonathon Karelse. Jonathon is the CEO of NorthFind Management and is a global leader in demand planning, operations, predictive analytics, and IBP. Jonathon, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, real pleasure to be here, Joe.
Jonathon, I guess, I feel bad for you because one of your expertise is I don't even know if that's a word, but anyway, one of your expertise is supply chain. And I'm sure when the term supply chain comes up in conversations with the most random person, people will probably have a very deep conversation with you. So talk to me about being someone involved in this space here in 2022.
It's really interesting, but before I ended up in operations, I was in law school. One of the lawyers I summered for gave me a great piece of advice, and that was don't ever tell anyone you're a lawyer unless you want to give out free advice for the rest of your life. And supply chain is, up until COVID, has been sufficiently obscure that you tell people that, and they usually go like, oh, that sounds interesting.
Right.
But now in 2021, 22, you tell someone you're in supply chain, like they have every manner of problem they want you to solve. Like, what can you tell me about container availability? What do you hear about container prices? What's going on with last mile delivery? It's really funny how things have turned.
And one of the big parts of your just sort of like your initiatives now is this book and podcast, Histories of the Future, and it's about business forecasting. And so I'm just going to ask you this. Could you have forecasted something like this ever happening?
I'm going to probably make some, maybe not enemies, but have some detractors when I say yes with an asterisk, although that's kind of a very consultancy answer to give.
It sure is.
Early when COVID struck in 2020, but before it had reached North America, I had journalists who wanted to talk to me about what the projected impact on supply chains was going to be from the perspective of COVID was hitting just at the same time that Chinese New Year was happening. And everybody who gets componentry or raw materials from China is already accustomed to having to load up orders in December because with Chinese New Year, you have a lot of productivity that gets dropped. So they planned for this, but what they didn't plan for was, hey, we're hearing some reports out of China that there's this flu going around and they're starting to close down cities. So we're going to try to order as much as we can now and see how long it lasts, and hopefully the flu passes. The journalists were asking, so, based on this mysterious flu in China, what are you hearing about supply chain disruption from people dealing with China? Is this a sign we deal too much with China? Is this a sign we should be reshoring? And the answer that I gave then was, listen, this isn't anything new. I mean, first of all, supply chain disruptions happen all the time. Big ones happen all the time. And between 2000 and 2020, we had a number of different global pandemics. Certainly not, they didn't end up where we've ended up with COVID, but we had swine flu, we had avian flu, we had
H1N1,
Zika,
right?
Yeah, H1N1, H1N5, West Nile, Ebola. None of that stuff blew up like it did, but early on, it had the potential to. And on top of those pandemics, we had the tsunami of 2008. We had the financial crisis. I mean, they're talking about the port strikes and the backlog at the Port of Los Angeles, but this is like an annual event practically. So the short answer to your question is we certainly couldn't have predicted COVID-19 and the degree to which it was going to impact us and the length of time it would. However, we certainly should have been prepared for supply chain disruption because this isn't new. And the problem is too many people weathered or got impacted by supply chain disruption. And rather than learning a lesson and baking risk mitigation into their operating plans, went back to business as usual, chasing basically lowest cost without accepting that taking on lowest cost and not having any risk mitigation plans it'll probably do well for a couple of years until the next crisis hits. But when it does, you're going to get exposed and it's going to be very expensive. And that's what we're seeing now.
It almost, I don't know if this is probably a fair analogy, but it almost has like this bubble effect, like, housing bubble, tech bubble. It's like there was this supply chain bubble that it was standing on such perilous ground that just about anything could throw it off, and something this big just threw it off exponentially.
Yeah. I mean, it's a matter, in supply chain, we talk about optimization. And what optimization means in practical terms is balancing the need to do things in a fiscally expedient way while also balancing the increasingly ridiculous expectations of customers. More and more people want things immediately. The gap between you going on to Amazon or some other web-based commerce site and seeing some new article of furniture or clothing or electronics that suddenly you need to have and you want it tomorrow, and the gap between what's involved in procuring the raw materials for making that article of clothing or electronics or furniture is in some cases upwards of 6 months. So to mitigate the gap between how fast you want something and the reality of how long it takes to make that, manufacturers forecast. They forecast to pre-build, and they pre-build to hold inventory. But holding inventory ties up cash, and it's also expensive. You need warehouses, you need to handle it. In some jurisdictions, you've got taxes on it, you've got insurance on it. So it's an expensive proposition to balance having the stuff that customers need and not having to have them wait too long. We've increasingly tried to shave that balance finer and finer. In other words, we're trying to meet everybody's expectations and get really, really precise at predicting what they need and when, so that we don't have to carry as much inventory. And it works as long as the history we're using to predict the future still looks like the future. But the second that landscape changes, as it did during COVID, now all these finely tuned models expose the fact that there is very little buffer in supply chain. Buffer for container movements, buffer for increased or early manufacturing, availability of raw materials. And then on top of that, you have now the psychological effect of when people hear that there's a shortage, now suddenly they want it even more and even sooner, which then compounds the effect and actually creates a shortage. It's very similar to what economists have recognized for decades. You start talking about recessions happen because when people hear recession, they get nervous. They stop spending. The economy is no longer stimulated, and a recession happens. It's the same thing with supply chain. We don't have the kind of mismatch between demand and supply that justifies the 5 or 6x increase in the price of container freight. I mean, nothing even close to it. What we have is way too many people talking about it, way too many people reacting to it, and now we've highlighted what are not 5 or 6x mismatches between demand and supply, but they don't need to be in order for there to be a capacity issue. We only need to have 10% more demand than we have supply to have a shortage. And that's exactly the kind of thing we're seeing.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there, but I'll unpack the one thing, and that's the storage part of it. And I remember at the early stages of the pandemic, I went to a grocery store, and it's hard to believe, but this is a time that there was no toilet paper anywhere. And I said to one of the managers, he looked flustered. I'm like, so what's going on with the toilet paper? Is there some sort of shortage? And he goes, no, there's no shortage. It's just that we can't keep like 100 pounds of toilet paper around here. And then all of a sudden there's this run of toilet paper. I'm like, we only have like one slat of it. It's not like we keep like 20 of those things. So that's why there was that shortage, or technically the shortage of toilet paper. It's not that there wasn't any, it's just that these stores couldn't keep it in their premises because it just takes up too much room. So
that's exactly right.
How do you remedy that, Jonathan? Because a lot of these items are tiny, like you said, like microchips or stuff like that. You could go have like hundreds of pounds of it and it'd be like one pallet. But what do you do with stuff like paper products and furniture that you can't really have like a giant warehouse just filled with stuff sitting around? I
mean, there's a couple of answers to that question. On the one hand, some people have thrown that heavy hammer approach to it, and that's why when you look at a store like a Walmart or a Costco, that's essentially what they've done. They've said, listen, whenever you need something, we're going to have it, and we buy at such scale that it's also going to be well priced. So they put up these monstrous footprints full of things that contain in normal circumstances, weeks and weeks, if not in some cases, months of supply so that it's always there. The average person can't do that. The average operator needs to balance the realities of available or free cash and how much of it they're willing to tie up in inventory to ensure that every time someone comes, the thing that they need is sitting there. And without going too far down the rabbit hole, this becomes kind of mathy. Basically, what we look at is balancing the average demand and the variability about that demand against the average replenishment lead time and the variability about it. So in other words, if I typically sell 10 units a day of toilet paper, but that's plus minus 2 units. So on a hot day, it's 12, and on a slower toilet paper day, it's 8. And my replenishment lead time is 3 days. Then when I'm getting down to my 20 or 30 rolls of toilet paper left, I need to have already been thinking about placing that order because I'm burning through 10 a day and it takes 3 days to get them back. If I'm not baking into the equation the fact that it's a 3-day lead time to get replenished on that toilet paper, but it's plus minus a day, I can end up with the perfect storm if I end up with a hot day of toilet paper sales and a slow day of replenishment, and now suddenly I've got a quote shortage. In a macro sense, I mean, the paper plants were all scratching their heads going like, who said there's a shortage?
Yeah.
We've got like loads of excess capacity. But on a micro level, you had all these instantaneous mismatches between the sudden peak in demand and what was available on the shelves. And when the shelves ran out, it seemed to reinforce for people, oh, there's a shortage. Now I need to overreact. And the reality was, if they would have taken a breath, supply chain would have replenished at the normal rate. And if they would have kept consuming at the normal rate, problem solved.
Right. Yeah, it was more of a consumption issue at that point. And you mentioned the reliance on China. And it's not only China. I mean, I know a lot of stuff gets produced overseas, whether it's in Indonesia or another Pacific nation. This over-reliance, is there any way around it? It doesn't seem like there is.
I don't call it an over-reliance. It wasn't me that asked the question of me about, are we relying too much on China? I'll say this. I'm a very big believer in market economics. And I think no matter what lessons we learn from COVID-19 or don't learn, because history has shown us we've had a lot of global supply chain disruptions, and some people adapted and most people went back to business as usual. Ultimately, manufacturers, distributors, and consumers even are going to buy things that meet their particular intersection of quality and price. And if that intersection of quality and price is best met by manufacturing in China or Vietnam or India or Bangladesh versus the premium that it costs because of associated input costs like labor and capital in North America, sure, it feels good to buy locally, and for some people they'll do that, but for a lot of people, price is going to be a bigger driver. So I think you're right, Joe. I don't think we're ever going to get around, maybe China in particular, because there's other geopolitical considerations. Yeah. China is acting fairly belligerently in its spheres of influence right now. So that may, from a risk management standpoint, have a short-term impact on how much people choose to deal with China. But I don't think we're ever going to get away from relying on globally sourced supply chains.
All right, Jonathan, I don't want to exhaust you with supply chain questions. So I want to move on to something that you're very passionate about, and that's behavioral economics. And I guess that plays a lot into what we've been talking about.
Absolutely.
So in a nutshell, how would you explain what that means?
Well, the traditional or historic way that we've understood human decision-making basically comes from neoclassical economics. So Adam Smith, in a year that means as much to economists as it does to Americans, 1776, wrote The Wealth of Nations. And one of the key premises in this really important book is he puts forth the idea that humans are basically rational actors. And when we're presented with choices of varying value or utility, we naturally choose the one that has the greatest utility to us. Makes sense. It's very intuitive. The only problem is they don't always do that. Economists call those people irrational, which is, I think, a convenient way for explaining why their models don't work. But what behavioral economics does is it looks at human decision-making not from the standpoint of varying value, but it looks at the the psychological drivers that impact decision making. And some of these drivers are unconscious. And it seeks to look at the various psychological lenses through which we think we're making objective choices based on values, which are actually, in many cases, not objective and not rational at all. It's looking at the psychology of decision making rather than the economics of decision making.
When it comes to decision making, I feel now we are incredibly, and maybe it's an overcorrection, we're incredibly data driven, where we've sort of removed the gut from any kind of decision. It's like the numbers are the numbers and it is what it is. What do you say to that? Like in terms of just making it all about the data as opposed to using some either experience or gut or whatever, or any kind of mystical kind of equation involved there. In terms of decision making, what do you think about that?
Sure. Well, Daniel Kahneman, who's one of the basically co-fathers of behavioral economics, along with Amos Tversky. So Daniel Kahneman says that gut is basically the product of experience. So sometimes data-driven folks who are maybe too overzealous to discount gut and intuition because they seem sort of ephemeral or non-tangential. It's first of all, I think, helpful to look at gut and intuition through that sort of Kahneman way of looking at it, which is it's not like a guess and it's not just a feeling. It's I've done this 10,000 times before. It looks like something I've done, so my experience is telling me I'm going to deal with it in the same way. In behavioral science terms, that's called a heuristic. It's a shortcut that we use to, rather than spending hours contemplating every decision, we can use experience to say, hey, this decision looks like a decision I've made many, many times before, and I'm going to deal with it the same way I dealt with it before to have the same positive outcome. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with decision making. I'm very much a proponent of data-led decision making, but I think people who get a little bit too strident about relying entirely on data and not at all on humans, first of all, overlook the fact that even in data selection, there can be biases. I mean, we can say that we're letting data make our decisions, but there's plenty of these truth seekers, for instance, who have data, albeit questionable, that they think support their claims. So with the preponderance of data that's available out there, there are, I think, counterintuitively still just as many opposing decisions that can be made from that data. It's a matter of being able to select data, interpret data, and vet data properly. There's ultimately a synergy between understanding where those natural frailties are in human decision-making and judgment and allowing data to shore those up, but also augmenting the value of data with judiciously applied human inputs. And there's decades of research that shows that when we combine the two together, decision-making is better than if we ever chose either one alone.
And you talk about bias and the fact that the preponderance of data nowadays, you know, if you listen to a podcast by like someone like Joe Rogan, he's always pulling out some study or survey. And I think that's the problem. We have too many studies or surveys and no one knows where they're coming from. No one knows if they're double blind, if they've been approved by a fellow colleagues or anything like that. So how do you work your way through that when you have all of this data and some of it is either really rock solid and some of it is like, it's a little fringy?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it comes down to work. And I think one of the things that has impacted the way we make decisions is data is too readily available, and we've stopped flexing our actual research muscles. So because I can Google something in 2 minutes, I no longer am as accustomed to deep diving on the provenance or validity of that data, number one. And number two, there's a type of bias that Kahneman and Tversky talked about called confirmation bias, but this is actually being reinforced with the amount of time people are spending online. Behavioral scientists today are calling it confirmation bubbles. So because the algorithms that we use for searching basically attempt to curate data according to what they think we think is going to be the most useful, so based on our search histories, based on our associations with certain websites and even people through our social media, we tend to then start to only get the kind of data that further supports the viewpoint we have, right, irrespective of whether or not that viewpoint is correct. I think the idea of being open to opposing data and the idea of double-clicking data and really trying to get to its source and its provenance is becoming a lost art. And science, real science, has always been based on attempting to disprove its own theories. So when I've got a great idea, I only become certain that it's a great idea once I've tried every possible way to disprove it. And the way we're acting today is I've got a great idea, and I go out and methodically search for studies and surveys and pieces of data that support my idea, and I'm not interested in anybody else's thought on it.
Yeah. And that's the problem. It's just too much of it. Because you, like you said, you could always find something in that confirmation bubble that will confirm your thoughts or feelings or something. So, it's so funny. We always we're so enamored by finding the truth and finding out more information, but sometimes there's just so much information. There's too much information.
Yes.
Yeah. And speaking of Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, as someone not as bright as you, Jonathan, man, they should have called that reading slow, because I felt like I really had to take my time with that book.
I think everybody, if they're honest, has to. It's funny. I did a behavioral science program at Harvard Business School with a couple of my colleagues, and in one of the opening sessions, the professor, Francesca Gino, who's actually gotten pretty well known on her own, asked how many people have read Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And, basically 90% of people put up their hand. And she said, okay, I'm going to cold call people. How many of you actually got out of the first chapter? And like 3/4 of the hands went down. It's not an easy read.
It's not easy to read. And I'm proud of myself that I actually did finish it. But it's so funny with that book. It's brilliant. It's great. It's smart. But a lot of it, didn't you feel like Jonathan was like, yeah, I kind of had a feeling about this. Like the whole, right? A lot of it was like it's sort of like had all this data to support a lot of the feelings that a lot of people that are rational thinkers already agree with.
Yeah, and that's what they say is one of the signs of a great idea, that once you've happened upon it, it seems like common sense. Yeah. And what Kahneman and Tversky really did, and then Richard Taylor sort of followed on in the early 80s, is proved out and made more clear these kind of impressions that we had about the way we make decisions. The idea of availability heuristic, the idea that if I repeat something enough times, people start to listen to it and believe it. I mean, advertisers understood this for 100 years before they did the research, but they started getting into the why and getting into the quantifying of it.
And, for mainstream folk, the idea around basing decisions on data analytics was introduced through the book Moneyball back in 2003 by Michael Lewis. So for me, that's where that's my basis of like, people, the old idea of like we talked about following your gut as opposed to using data and analytics. When did you fall in love with like numbers and analytics and forecasting?
Well, that's 3 different questions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I've always loved math. I've loved math from the beginning. And I think the fact that the first thing that I thought I was going to be, well, actually the very first thing when I was 6 years old was a garbage man. I thought it looked so cool, the guy hanging off the back of the truck. But my parents, bless their hearts, put a swift end to that aspiration. But the first thing that I thought I was going to be was a theoretical physicist. And so I was reading...
That's a big jump.
Yeah, it is. There might have been some parental bias there as well. Yeah. I got Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time for my 12th birthday.
Oh, jeez.
And I fell in love not only with the idea of sort of these overarching unifying truths of the universe, but the idea that mathematics, more than anything else, was this language through which we could understand universally pretty much anything in life. The idea, like Foucault said, that if it exists, it can be quantified. And once it can be quantified, we can start to, through calculus, understand the relationships of certain dynamics to other dynamics. And that to me was just such a beautiful idea. So the last part of your question was forecasting. I mean, forecasting to me was just a natural extension of the math of life. If I can understand past processes and I can understand the causalities of those past processes, then I can take a crack, at least an educated guess at what the future is going to look like. And the virtue of doing that is, in doing so, I can reduce waste. Now, reducing waste is code in most corporations for profitability. So there is a happy economic benefit to doing it as well. But in more real human terms, for instance, more than half of agriculture produced annually gets wasted in supply chains and food production. And the number one reason for that, and there's a number, but the number one reason for that is fundamental mismatches between demand planning and supply planning. So in other words, if we could ever get perfect at that, and we can't, and I'm not suggesting we can, but if we could ever get perfect at that or even much better at that, we'd be able to feed substantially more. I mean, theoretically, double the number of people that get fed today without having to expand our agricultural footprint. I mean, that's just one way that forecasting can have a profound human impact.
I wonder, as a 12-year-old reading Stephen Hawking, did you have a lot of friends?
I mean, now I would say you're exhibiting some additional biases. What are you going to say if I say no?
No, it was really just an open-ended question. I didn't know if, I wasn't expecting a number. Yeah,
Yes, I did have friends, Joe. Thank you.
Well, Jonathan, this has been a great chat. Thank you for letting me rib you a little bit. His name is Jonathon Karelse. He is the CEO of NorthFind Management. Jonathan, thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, always great to be here, Joe. Thanks.
You're very welcome. And that's it for this episode of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a quick second to subscribe so you automatically get new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I would love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.